He returned home, and she was still waiting. The train's whistle pierced the crisp October air of 1945, carrying with it the weight of promises kept and hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with uncertainty. Samuel Hartwell pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, watching the familiar landscapes of rural Pennsylvania unfold before him like pages from a half-forgotten book. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days had passed since he'd last seen these rolling hills painted in autumn's fire. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days since he'd kissed Eleanor goodbye on this very platform, her tears still warm on his lips as the train carried him toward a war that would test every fiber of who they were. We bring the forgotten letters, the hidden kisses, and the untold romances of wartime to life. Subscribe to be part of it. The uniform felt foreign against his skin now, too loose in some places where hunger had carved away at him, too tight in others where muscle had hardened under the weight of survival. His reflection in the window showed a stranger, hollow cheeks, eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. But beneath the surface changes, beneath the scars both visible and hidden, Samuel Hartwell was still the man who had fallen in love with Eleanor Mitchell beneath the summer stars of 1941. Eleanor. Even her name was a prayer on his lips, a talisman he'd carried through the mud of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the long, bitter march toward Berlin. Her letters had been his lifeline, arriving sporadically, but always at moments when hope seemed as distant as home itself. The last one had reached him in a field hospital outside Cologne, her careful handwriting promising that she would be waiting, that nothing, not time, not distance, not the terrible silence that had stretched between his letters, could change what lived in her heart. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Millbrook Station. Samuel's chest tightened, and he found himself unable to swallow past the emotion lodged in his throat. What if she had changed her mind? What if the man returning home was too different from the boy who had left? What if the war had taken more from him than he'd realized? He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to that summer of 1941, when the world was teetering on the edge of chaos, but their corner of Pennsylvania still felt safe and eternal. He'd been working at Morrison's hardware store, saving every penny for the engagement ring he'd hidden in his sock drawer. Eleanor taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, her gentle manner with children revealing the tender heart that had captured his completely. They would meet every evening after work, walking the tree-lined streets of Millbrook as shadows grew long and children's laughter drifted from open windows. "I want to marry you, Ellie," he had whispered one evening as they sat by Miller's Creek, her head resting against his shoulder. "I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old watching sunsets like this one." She had turned in his arms then, her green eyes reflecting the dying light like emeralds held to flame. "Then ask me properly, Samuel Hartwell," she had said, her voice teasing but her expression serious. "Ask me and see what I say." But December 7th had shattered those plans like glass against stone. Pearl Harbor brought the war crashing into their peaceful world, and suddenly every able-bodied man in Millbrook was faced with an impossible choice. Samuel had enlisted 3 days later, driven by duty and the naive belief that the war would be over quickly, that he'd be home by Christmas with stories to tell and a future to claim. The engagement ring had finally been presented, not in some romantic setting, but on the platform of this very train station, with steam hissing around their feet and the weight of goodbye heavy in the air. Eleanor had said yes through her tears, had promised to wait, had pressed a small silver locket into his hands, a locket that now hung around his neck like a sacred charm. "Promise me something," she had said, her voice barely audible above the train's mechanical breathing. "Promise me that no matter what happens over there, no matter how long you're gone, you'll remember this moment. Remember us." "I promise," he had whispered back, meaning it with every cell in his body. "I promise, Ellie. I'll come back to you." The train began to slow and Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window he could see the familiar red brick station house, the weathered benches where travelers waited, the large oak tree whose branches had sheltered countless reunions and farewells. A small crowd had gathered on the platform, families waiting for their soldiers to come home, sweethearts and wives and children who had counted days the same way he had. And there, standing slightly apart from the others, was Eleanor. Even from a distance, even after 3 years of wondering if his memory had painted her more beautiful than reality, Samuel felt his breath catch. She wore a blue dress he didn't recognize, her dark hair longer than before and pinned back in victory rolls that must have taken careful preparation. But her posture, the way she held herself with quiet dignity while her hands twisted nervously at her sides, that was purely Eleanor, the woman he had loved from the moment she'd accidentally spilled coffee on his shoes at Murphy's diner. The train shuddered to a complete stop, and suddenly the car was filled with movement and noise as passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Samuel remained frozen in his seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment. How did one cross the bridge between who they had been and who they had become? How did one return to a love that had been preserved in amber while everything else in the world had changed? A gentle touch on his shoulder made him look up. An elderly woman in the seat across from him was smiling kindly, her eyes understanding in the way that only comes from experience with life's deeper currents. "Go to her, son," she said softly. "She's been waiting long enough." Samuel nodded, unable to speak, and rose on unsteady legs. His duffel bag felt impossibly heavy as he slung it over his shoulder and joined the line of passengers making their way toward the door. Each step carried him closer to Eleanor, closer to the life he had dreamed of through 3 years of nightmare, closer to discovering whether love could indeed conquer the distance that war had created between them. The platform smelled of coal smoke and autumn leaves, of coffee from the station's small cafe, and the crisp promise of winter. Samuel stepped down from the train car and found himself swept up in the chaos of reunion, soldiers embracing families, tears of joy mixing with tears of relief, the sound of laughter and conversation creating a symphony of homecoming. But through it all, his eyes never left Eleanor. She had seen him now, and the expression on her face, surprise and joy and something that might have been fear, sent him walking toward her with steps that grew more confident with each heartbeat. The crowd seemed to part around them, as if the world understood that this moment belonged to them alone. They stopped 3 feet apart, close enough to touch but separated by the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed. Samuel drank in the sight of her, noting the new lines around her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she clasped them in front of her, the silver chain around her neck that held what he hoped was the engagement ring he had given her. "Hello, Ellie," he said, his voice rougher than he remembered, scarred by months of shouting orders and breathing smoke. "Hello, Sam," she replied, and her voice was exactly as he remembered, warm and steady and full of music. They stared at each other for a moment that felt like an eternity. Two people who had loved each other completely, but were now, in many ways, strangers. The boy who had left Millbrook had been replaced by a man who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow survived it. The girl who had waved goodbye from this platform had become a woman who had learned to live with uncertainty, to hope when hope seemed foolish, to maintain faith in a future that might never come. "You're thinner," Eleanor said finally, her voice catching slightly on the words. "You're beautiful," Samuel replied, meaning it completely. "More beautiful than I remembered, if that's possible." A smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and suddenly the distance between them felt less insurmountable. "I was afraid you might have forgotten what I looked like," she said. 3 years is a long time." "Not long enough to forget you," Samuel said, taking a step closer. "I carried you with me everywhere, Ellie. In every letter, in every moment when I thought I might not make it home. You were the reason I kept going." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back with the same determination he remembered from their courtship. Eleanor Mitchell had never been one to cry easily, but when she did, it meant everything. "I kept your letters," she said. "Every single one. I read them so many times the paper started to fall apart." "I'm sorry there weren't more," Samuel said, remembering the long months when communication had been impossible, when he'd been moving from one battlefield to another with no way to send word home. "There were times when I couldn't write, when I didn't know if you were still—" "I was still waiting," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm. "I never stopped waiting, Sam, even when people told me I should move on, that the war might— that you might not—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They both knew how many boys from Millbrook hadn't come home, How many telegrams had been delivered to houses that would never be the same? Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to, and touched her cheek with fingers that remembered the exact curve of her face. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if she were memorizing the sensation. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not the same man who left you on this platform. The war, it changes you, Ellie. It takes pieces of who you were and replaces them with things you never wanted to carry. I've done things, seen things that I can never undo or forget. I'm not sure I'm the man you fell in love with anymore." She opened her eyes and looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Do you still love me?" she asked simply. "With everything I am," he answered without hesitation. "More than I did when I left, if that's possible. You were the light I followed home, Ellie. You were the reason I survived." "Then you're still the man I fell in love with," she said, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "The rest we can figure out together." The crowd around them had begun to thin as families drifted away from the platform, but Samuel and Eleanor remained frozen in their bubble of reunion, reluctant to move forward into whatever came next. Finally, Eleanor glanced around and seemed to realize they were becoming a spectacle. "Come on," she said, taking his hand in hers with a confidence that surprised him. "Let's go home." Home. The word hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it implications he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Where was home for him now? Was it the small apartment above Murphy's diner that he'd rented before the war? Was it wherever Eleanor was? Or was it something he would have to rebuild from the ground up, piece by careful piece? They walked through the streets of Millbrook in comfortable silence, their fingers intertwined but their steps careful, as if they were both afraid of moving too fast, of expecting too much too soon. The town looked exactly as Samuel remembered it. The same white houses with their neat front yards, the same shops lining Main Street, the same sense of permanence that had made this place feel like the center of the universe when he was young. But everything looked smaller somehow, less significant than his memories had painted it. 3 years of seeing the world, even the terrible parts of it, had given him perspective he wasn't sure he wanted. Millbrook was still beautiful, still peaceful, still the kind of place where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. But it no longer felt like the whole world, and he wasn't sure if that was growth or loss. "Mrs. Henderson at the post office asks about you every time I go in," Eleanor said as they passed the familiar brick building. "She still has that picture of you in uniform taped to her window." "I remember her," Samuel said, smiling slightly. "She used to slip extra stamps into my letters when she thought no one was looking." "The whole town's been keeping track of you," Eleanor continued, "following your unit in the papers when they could, celebrating when we heard you'd made it through Normandy, worrying when the letters stopped coming." She paused, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "We lost 12 boys, Sam. 12 boys from our little town." Samuel felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Survivor's guilt, the doctors at the hospital had called it. Why had he made it home when so many others hadn't? Why had his story ended with a train platform reunion, while theirs ended with telegrams and folded flags? "I know some of them," he said quietly. "Jimmy Patterson was in my unit for a while. Good kid. Talked about his girl back home all the time." He stopped walking and turned to face Eleanor. "I need you to understand something, Ellie. The fact that I'm standing here with you right now, the fact that I made it home, it's not because I was braver or stronger or better than the boys who didn't. It's just luck. Random, senseless luck." She studied his face, and he could see her processing not just his words, but the pain behind them. "You feel guilty," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Every day," he admitted. "Every morning I wake up and remember that I'm alive and they're not, and I can't figure out why. What makes me special? What gives me the right to come home when they can't?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You don't get to choose who lives and who dies, Sam. You never did. But you do get to choose what you do with the life you've been given. You can honor their memory by building something good with the time you have left." They resumed walking, and Samuel found himself studying Eleanor's profile as she spoke. The war had changed her too, he realized. There was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that spoke of someone who had learned to make difficult decisions and live with their consequences. She had grown up while he was gone, had become not just a woman, but a woman who knew her own mind. "What did you do?" he asked. "During the war, I mean. Your letters mentioned the hospital, but you never went into detail." A shadow crossed her face, and he immediately regretted the question. "I volunteered at the Veterans Hospital in Harrisburg," she said after a moment. 3 days a week after school, more during the summers. I helped with the boys who came back." She trailed off, and he understood. She had helped with the boys who came back broken, who needed more than medical attention to heal. "That must have been difficult," he said. "It was necessary," she replied simply. "I couldn't fight overseas, couldn't do much to help end the war, but I could help the boys who made it home. I could write letters for the ones whose hands wouldn't work anymore, read to the ones who couldn't see, just sit with the ones who couldn't sleep." She glanced at him sideways. "It helped me understand what you might be going through over there, what you might need when you came home." They had reached Eleanor's house, a small white cottage with blue shutters that her mother had left her when she passed 2 years ago. Samuel had fond memories of this place, of Sunday dinners and evenings spent on the front porch swing, of asking Eleanor's father for permission to court his daughter. Now it looked like the most beautiful place on earth. "Would you like to come in?" Eleanor asked, and there was something almost shy in her voice. "I could make coffee. Real coffee, not that awful chicory substitute we've been drinking." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice. The simple domesticity of the offer, coffee in Eleanor's kitchen, sitting at her table like they used to do, felt almost too good to be real. He followed her up the front steps, noting the small details that spoke of her life during his absence. New curtains in the windows, a Victory Garden plot in the side yard that was now planted with autumn vegetables, a small red star in the front window that indicated a family member serving overseas. The inside of the house was exactly as he remembered it, but everything felt smaller, more intimate. Eleanor moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, filling the coffee pot with water, measuring grounds into a filter with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every ration last. Samuel sat at the small table by the window and watched her, trying to reconcile this competent, self-sufficient woman with the girl he had left behind. "I kept your picture on the mantel," Eleanor said as she waited for the coffee to brew. "Right next to the radio so I could look at it while I listened to Edward R. Murrow's reports from London." She turned to face him, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. "I tried to imagine where you were, what you were doing. Sometimes I would get scared that something had happened to you and I wouldn't know for weeks or months." "There were times when I didn't know if I would make it to the next day," Samuel admitted. "Times when writing a letter seemed pointless because I wasn't sure anyone would be left to mail it." He looked down at his hands, noticing for the first time how they had aged in 3 years, how the knuckles were more prominent, the fingers more weathered. "I thought about you constantly, but sometimes it felt like torture, like I was holding on to something that might not exist anymore when I got back." The coffee finished brewing, and Eleanor poured 2 cups, adding sugar to his the way he had always preferred it. She remembered, he thought. After 3 years, she still remembered how he liked his coffee. The thought was both comforting and overwhelming. She sat across from him at the table, cradling her cup in both hands, as if she needed the warmth. "I was afraid too," she said quietly. "Afraid that you would come back different, that the war would change you so much that we wouldn't know each other anymore. Afraid that you would decide you didn't want the life we had planned, that you'd want something bigger than Millbrook could offer." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "The war did change me, Ellie. It changed everything about who I thought I was. But it didn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it made me more certain that this," he gestured between them, "this is what I want. This is what I fought to come home to." She turned her hand palm up and laced their fingers together, the gesture as natural as breathing, despite the years that had passed. "Then we'll figure out the rest as we go," she said. "We'll learn who we are now, together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and simply being in each other's presence. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber. Samuel found himself memorizing the moment, the taste of real coffee on his tongue, the warmth of Eleanor's hand in his, the peace of knowing he was finally, truly home. "I have something for you," Eleanor said suddenly, releasing his hand and disappearing into the living room. She returned with a small wooden box that Samuel recognized. It had belonged to her grandmother, and she had always kept her most precious possessions in it. She set the box on the table and lifted the lid carefully. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a man's watch, gold with a white face and elegant hands that had stopped at 11:47. "It was my father's," Eleanor explained. "He gave it to me the night before he died, told me to save it for the man I married." She lifted the watch from the box with reverent care. "I had it repaired last month. I wanted it to be perfect when you came home." Samuel stared at the watch, overwhelmed by the significance of the gesture. In a world where everything had been destroyed and rebuilt, where nothing seemed permanent anymore, Eleanor was offering him something that connected him to the past, to family, to the promise of a future. "Ellie, he began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "I know we haven't talked about the future yet," she said. "I know you need time to readjust, to figure out who you are now, but I want you to have this. I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter how long it takes us to find our way back to each other completely, I'm not going anywhere." He took the watch from her hands, feeling the weight of it, the smooth warmth of the gold. When he turned it over, he saw that she had had it engraved, "To Samuel with all my love, E.M." "Will you put it on me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded and moved around the table to stand beside his chair. Her fingers were gentle as she fastened the watch around his wrist, her touch sending familiar shivers up his arm. When she finished, she didn't move away, and he found himself looking up into her face, seeing in her eyes all the love and patience and hope that had sustained them both through 3 years of separation. "Ellie," he whispered, and then she was in his arms, her body fitting against his as perfectly as it always had. He held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her against his chest. This was real. This was home. This was the future he had dreamed of in foxholes and field hospitals, and long dark nights when hope seemed impossible. "I love you," she murmured against his neck. "I love who you were, and I love who you are now, and I'll love whoever you become tomorrow." "I love you too," he said, pulling back to look at her face. "More than I have words for, more than I knew was possible." They kissed then, softly at first, tentatively, like teenagers discovering love for the first time. But as the familiarity returned, as muscle memory kicked in and they remembered the rhythm of each other, the kiss deepened, became a promise and a homecoming and a new beginning all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "Stay," she whispered. "Stay with me tonight. Not for anything more than just being together. I just want to know you're really here, that I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and find out this was all a dream." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears he hadn't seen her shed. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "I'm home, Ellie, finally completely home." As the last light faded from the kitchen windows, they moved to the living room, to the sofa where they had spent so many evenings before the war changed everything. Eleanor curled up against Samuel's side, her head on his shoulder, while he held her close and marveled at the simple miracle of her presence. They talked quietly as the stars came out, sharing pieces of the years they had spent apart. Eleanor told him about the students she had taught, the children who had reminded her daily that life continued even in wartime, that hope was always being reborn in new forms. She spoke of the letters she had written to soldiers overseas, of the care packages she had organized through the church, of the small ways she had tried to contribute to the war effort from home. Samuel shared what he could of his own experiences, the friendships forged in impossible circumstances, the moments of unexpected beauty he had found even in the midst of horror, the letters from home that had arrived like lifelines when he needed them most. He spoke carefully, editing out the worst parts, the images that still haunted his dreams. Those stories could wait, might always wait. Tonight was for healing, for reunion, for remembering what they had fought to preserve. "Do you remember our last night together?" Eleanor asked as the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. "Before you left for basic training?" Samuel smiled, his fingers combing gently through her hair. "We walked down to Miller's Creek and sat on the old bridge until dawn. You made me promise to come back to you." "And you made me promise to be here when you did," she added. "We both kept our promises." "We did," he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Against all odds, we both kept our promises." They fell asleep there on the sofa, wrapped in each other's arms, fully clothed but more intimate than they had ever been before. Samuel's last conscious thought was of the watch on his wrist, its steady tick a counterpoint to Eleanor's breathing, both sounds marking time in a world where time had suddenly become precious again. He woke before dawn to find Eleanor watching him, her green eyes soft in the grey light filtering through the windows. "Good morning," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of their reunion. "Good morning," he replied, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "How long have you been awake?" "A while," she admitted. "I kept waking up to make sure you were really here." He understood. The reality of their reunion still felt fragile, too good to be entirely trusted. "I'm here," he said, sitting up and pulling her with him. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor made breakfast while Samuel cleaned up in the small bathroom of her bedroom, and as he stood looking at himself in the mirror, really looking, not just glancing, he began to see what she saw. Yes, he was thinner, older, marked by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. But he was still fundamentally himself, still the man who had fallen in love with a schoolteacher in a small Pennsylvania town. Over eggs and toast and more real coffee, they began to talk about the future. Samuel had his discharge papers and a small amount of savings from his army pay. Eleanor had kept her teaching job and had been putting aside money as well, saving toward the life they had planned before the war interrupted everything. "I thought maybe we could start small," Eleanor said, refilling his coffee cup. "Maybe you could get your job back at Morrison's Hardware, just until you figure out what you really want to do. We could get married in the spring, rent a little place of our own." Samuel nodded, but she must have seen something in his expression because she paused, the coffee pot halfway back to the stove. "What is it?" "I don't know if I can go back to selling nails and paintbrushes," he said honestly. "Not after everything that's happened. It seems so small." Instead of being hurt, Eleanor smiled. "Then we'll figure out something else. Maybe you could use the GI Bill, go to college, or start your own business. Or we could leave Millbrook entirely, go somewhere new and build a life from scratch." She sat back down across from him. "The point isn't what we do, Sam. The point is that we do it together." Her words hit him like a revelation. For 3 years, he had been focused on getting back to the life he had left behind, to the plans they had made before the war. But maybe the point wasn't to recreate the past. Maybe the point was to use everything they had learned, everything they had become, to build something new and better than what they had lost. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you happy teaching? Is that what you want to keep?"